I'm Dr. Sage Breslin, and this is Breaking Through. And today we are joined by Julie Hruska. She has a story to tell that I already know I can relate to. And I'm so excited for her to be here with us as we continue our journey to look at how people break through the obstacles that present in their lives in order to really achieve the very best version of themselves and their lives and their professions. So I am so looking forward to having Julie here so we can talk and hear more about how she's achieved what she has. So welcome, Julie.
Thank you, Sage. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you really so much for having me.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So I'm going to just give you a few seconds to maybe say a little bit about yourself and how people might know you, either on LinkedIn or Facebook or through social media. The people who know you personally probably won't need this intro.
Yeah. My name's Julie Hruska. I'm a certified high performance coach and a high performance strategist. I work with individuals to help them examine the areas of their career, relationships, health, and finance to determine where they're functioning at their optimal levels and where there's room for growth. And then we create a strategic plan to get there. And then with corporate groups, I work to help companies engage their people and energize their organizations through the same high performance habits.
Wonderful.
That's
Wonderful.
my little elevator pitch.
I love it.
Of what I do, the condensed version.
Yeah, maybe you'll tell us more about kind of what some of those tips and steps are. Yeah,
And
wonderful.
as we go along, it's always so much more. It's always so much more than you can put on paper and really, give the elevator pitch of what you do.
Yes. We know that the elevator is only about 30 seconds long.
Yes.
And it's so rare for people to really get to know us personally and be even able to relate to us when we, kind of do our marketing pitch. And
Right.
I think something that you and I have in common is as fairly private people, learning to sort of set aside the urge to wear the mask or the armor or what I used to refer to as my uniform, in order to engage with people. And as we are learning to set that aside, people really get to know us and embrace ourselves as our own brands. So that's a lot about what this show is.
Yeah.
So really excited to get to know more about you and your story.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the backstory, how you got from where you were to where you are.
Yeah. So I grew up in Iowa, a nice, very conservative Christian family where I was raised with, I kind of call them 1950s views of women, right? Like I was raised to grow up, get married, have children, quit my job, raise my children, because that's what I was told good mothers do. And I followed that path because when you're indoctrinated into a belief system, you do what you're supposed to do. You don't question it because you're raised that that's right. And it's all black and white, right? And so I went to college. I met a man. I got engaged at 19, married at 20, started having kids at 24, quit my job, raised my kids. I had 3 kids by the time I was 31. And something wasn't right. I was having a lot of anxiety. I actually had treatment for my anxiety. And this was in 2005. So at the time, I only had 2 of my children. And looking back, I recently looked back at my journaling from the psychologist, and she basically said, there's not a mental illness. There's not something to that standard here. What's really happening with you is you don't have an identity and you don't have a support system. And yet it took me until 5 years later in 2010, when I was out in Colorado Springs, Colorado at a brain-based gender differences conference, to have what I call my awakening experience, where life hit me in the face and I realized I'd been sleepwalking through my life. So even though someone brought it to my attention in 2005, it wasn't until 5 years later that I really woke up. And in that time, I realized I don't know whose life this is.
Mm.
I'm in somebody else's story and I'm not writing it. And, some people talk about an awakening like it's an amazing event and it's so wonderful and it's all sunshine and roses. No, it's terrifying. Because when you realize that you're not living the life you were created to live, you have to make hard decisions. And the hardest one, the one that was most obvious at the time, was that I was in a very toxic relationship. Because when you're raised to basically give everything up for a husband and children, that makes you play small. And so the very first thing I had to do was have the difficult conversation with my former husband, which is, this isn't healthy, this isn't working. And interestingly enough, this is 2010, he said no. I said, I need a divorce. He said no.
my.
And again, it's not like it happens in the movies, right? He says no. Suddenly, my credit card is gone. Suddenly, my bank account
Oh,
is
no.
tightened. And now I look back, and what my lawyer showed me was like entrapment. At the time, I didn't know. All I knew was I was being punished, and the way I was raised is it was my fault.
Yeah.
And so I had to work through so many things to get to the point where in 2014, 4 years after I asked for a divorce, I actually left.
Wow.
And my wake up call there was my son. My oldest son is severely dyslexic, ADHD. I went in his room one night to talk to him, and he'd just gotten out of the shower. And he was sitting on the floor of his room with his head down, looking at his whatever device it was at the time. And he had a bald spot in his head, like on his scalp. And I had mentored middle school girls, so I knew right away. It's called trichotillomania. You pull your hair, anxiety-based. And I asked him right away, I said, sweetheart, how long have you been pulling your hair? And he just buried his face in my lap, tears streaming down his face. He's like, I just can't do this anymore. And, without going into too much on that level, because I'm not here to talk about my former husband, but basically my son felt a lot of anxiety because of the pressure being put on him from his father. And I realized that what I thought was staying in a marriage for my kids was not healthy. And that, what I had decided, what people had told me about wanting a divorce was that it was selfish. And I believed that because that's how I was raised, right? You don't get a divorce unless. And so I was told it was selfish. I thought I was selfish. So from 2010, 2014, I'm staying in this toxic situation. And now I can't lie to myself anymore because now my son is here with a bald spot on his head because I'm not dealing with the issues. And that was the big wake-up call. That was the big, you need to leave now.
Yeah, there's so much of what you're sharing that I can relate to. Not only the timing, but I think the ins and outs of what you've shared. I love how vulnerable you are and what you're sharing because, as you said, these are the stories that people relate to. These are the stories that free other people as well. And that's largely what this show is just an opportunity for people to dial in and hear that they're not alone and that there is a pathway and that
Yeah.
breaking through into that pathway is how we release ourselves into what we can be. I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday, and he was sharing some things, and I thought, gosh, that sounds to me like he is maybe got this preference or that preference. And I said, well, is it possible that, you have these kinds of feelings? And he said, no. And I said, okay, well, from my perspective,
Right.
that's kind of what I'm seeing. If this were different and that were different, and you could find this wonderful like vulnerability and intimacy, with a person like this, do you think maybe that would be good for you? And he
Right.
said, no.
Right.
And he said, that doesn't exist in my culture. And I said, so when I look at where you are, I see this door. And if you walk through the door, there's a life that can actually bring you joy. And he
Yeah.
said, nope, there's no door there. And I remember just feeling in my body the sort of the anguish of that,
Mhm.
that in our lives, there's a door that we can walk through. And yet, sometimes self-protectively, sometimes protecting someone else, we create this sheen, this drape, this barrier so that we can't even see the door.
Yeah.
And sometimes it is that indoctrination that you talked about, that if your family teaches you, like, there's no way out, right?
Right.
You are with this person, you made a
Mhm.
vow, you're going to stay
Yeah.
here until you die or he
Mhm.
dies, and
Yeah.
that's what it is. And so even when somebody else, like a therapist, says to you, I don't think this is good for you. I think
Right.
probably it's time to start extricating
Mhm.
yourself. And you're like, no, no, no.
Yeah.
Why would you say that?
And it made me realize, and this is what I realized, and it changes the game as far as me being a coach now, is people cannot see what they're not ready to see.
Yeah.
And so unless they're open to it, it's why I don't go and like try to get clients.
Yeah.
I have all these marketing people all the time, like, I can help you generate leads. I can help you do this. I'm like, I can't go tell someone they need coaching.
Yeah.
They have to know they need coaching.
Yeah.
Because if they're not open to it, they're going to be just like I was, sitting on that couch, listening, nodding my head, but not doing anything to change it. And
Right.
life happens when you take action,
Mhm.
right? So the awareness, for me, I feel so blessed that I woke up, that I was in a situation where people were calling me by my name, asking for my opinion. And it was such a stark difference than my home life that it
Sure.
really was jarring. It was like, wait a second, I have a name.
Yeah.
Like, that's how crazy it was.
Yeah.
I was 𝐒𝐚𝐿 mom. I was so-and-so's wife, but nobody asked my opinion. Nobody said Julie. I never heard my name. And what's crazy about this is at that time, people were connecting on Facebook, right? From this conference. So I went home. I'm like, oh, I'm going to join Facebook. I couldn't find a picture of me.
Wow.
I'd been taking all the pictures.
Yeah.
Mostly of my kids, a few with their dad, none of me. I really didn't exist.
Yeah. It's
And
amazing how invisible you can be in an
yeah,
unhealthy relationship. But
yeah,
that is the nature of, for those of us who have had relationships with people who have borderline personality or narcissism,
mhm,
we don't really exist. We are
right,
useful.
right,
And as long as we're useful, we're kept around. But
right,
there isn't, and that's not a judgment about people with those
no,
diagnoses.
right,
It's just an acknowledgement that they don't have the skills to
right,
engage with the other human, like with
right,
the soul within us, right? Like they
right,
just don't. That's missing in action.
yeah,
And so, unfortunately, they learn tools to manipulate and um, curb our behavior so
right,
their needs are getting met. And
right,
sometimes the need is they want to look good, which I mean, people with borderline do really well.
right,
Like it's how that charm and that skill manipulating other people is that's how they can plug and play. That's how they get what they need.
right,
And, unfortunately for us, it doesn't, our needs are really never met because we don't really exist.
right,
We are by and large invisible in those circumstances. And, for those who get the more sort of aggressive stance, they start to gaslight. And as they gaslight, we disappear more and more. And as the gaslighting takes hold, we develop Stockholm syndrome. And in Stockholm syndrome, which I would love to see the name change to be trauma-based perceptual distortion, because our perceptions morph to theirs.
Mhm.
We no longer stand in our truth, but we
Right.
slide into the truth that we're served up. And it's
Yeah.
amazing how people just don't really understand, like, okay, if you're in a toxic relationship, why didn't you just leave?
Yeah.
Well, you would have had to actually find your truth first,
Yeah.
because without your truth, without the ability to stand on your own 2 feet, what exactly would you do?
Yeah, and there's so much you said in there that resonates with me, and it shows up in so many different ways. Even after I moved out into the house I'm into now, I remember coming back from work and looking around the house when it was messy, and my internal voice was my former husband's. "Oh, you're so lazy. You're such a slob. Look at this place. It's embarrassing." That's
Oof.
not me. That wasn't even true.
Yeah.
But
Push the
after
eject button.
17 years of that,
Yeah.
that
Yes.
became my inner voice, and all of the mindset work and all of the, internal work that I've done over the last 7 years. It's a lot because
Yeah.
you have to undo
Yes.
all of the training
Right.
that you have gone through, and it's a training, however you label it. It's an undoing of these cycles, these habits, and as we know, you can do it, right? And that's what I think that people miss with me, because I don't talk about myself and my story a lot. That I'm not out there telling people you can change your life because I read it in a book.
Right.
Like, I've done the work.
Yeah. I think that's people can really feel the difference. When you have traveled a pathway and you have taken the time, energy, money, blood, sweat, and tears to find yourself amidst the rubble,
Mhm.
and to breathe new life into yourself and to create the self-care and the sanctuary that's sufficient for you to blossom
Mhm.
and, become yourself again,
Yeah.
and maybe become yourself for the first time.
Yeah.
Because so many of us were raised in environments where the indoctrination was already there.
Right.
People who are in just straight up violent relationships, they don't actually develop Stockholm syndrome.
Right.
They just leave, like, right, they
Yeah.
die or they leave.
Right.
People who develop Stockholm syndrome, or morph into another person's truth,
Mhm.
they grew up in an environment where there's a legacy in place to get that started. There's that, as you said, indoctrination for serving someone else, taking on somebody else's truth, standing outside your own power. And, I think many of us, had to weigh and measure how we could step away from our families largely in
Yes.
order to, you know, allow that growth and that development to happen. And
Yeah.
it can be very painful because we love our families, and at the same time, we have to make room for, the parts of us, our core selves that are
Yeah.
sitting there in the vault just waiting for us to
Yeah.
actually, you know, feed
Right.
and nurture so that we can bloom.
Yeah, and for me, what I didn't know and what I know now, you know, is that I married my mother.
Mm,
The pattern of the relationship with my mother, avoiding her getting angry,
mhm.
avoiding getting the belt, right?
Yeah,
Avoiding those things, I turned into a people pleaser.
sure.
So then I get into this scenario where my job is to serve, and I'm a people pleaser. And it was about my children and my husband, and there was no me. I was dissolved. And seeing it now, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how I was that person,
Yeah.
because it's shocking. It's jarring. It's jarring to look back and say, people always say that to me. Well, why did you stay? I don't know. I didn't know it was happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
The anxiety was a warning sign. It was the red flag, but I missed it. Because
Sure.
again, I wasn't in the position to recognize it. We always get the breadcrumbs, right? But it usually is the slap in the face that wakes us up.
Yeah. And it's so painful when, I think for most of us in those kinds of circumstances, the slap in the face is harm to our children. And it may be from a perpetrating spouse, or it may simply be that, the conflict in the relationship or the conflict in the home begins to affect our children, whether their
Yeah.
grades start to drop, whether they develop, emotional issues, whether they develop a behavioral, element to it, like trichotillomania or
Yeah.
um, self-harm, eating disorders, even mood disorders. And,
Yeah.
again, we don't extricate ourselves for us, because typically when we leave, there is no us yet.
Right.
It's like
Right.
this small, it's hidden in a vault,
Yeah.
and we can't really even access it very well. As you said, you were invisible. You didn't even sort of know yourself. You didn't know why you couldn't leave. It was
Yeah.
all just sort of, behind the door. And, that bald spot on your son's head was, you finally, like, the curtain slid away and you were like, "Oh my God, there's the
Mhm.
door. Okay,
Yeah.
let's go." And
Right.
even as we say, "Let's go," and we walk through the door, it's a it's surreal.
Yeah.
And we start to realize, like, "Okay, what am I doing? What do I need to do next?
Right.
How am I gonna do that? Where's the money gonna come from?
Mhm.
Who's gonna help us? Can I take any of this stuff out of the house?"
Right.
It's really, an unsettling and a frightening process for a lot of
Yeah.
us.
I mean, my bank account got drained. I had a joint bank account. I was left with $3.23. It was because I guess that's what the bank held aside. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I was teaching at the time. I had an income, but it was a joint account. And everything
Mm.
was joint because I married so young. So I had no credit. I
Right.
had nothing. And my family at the time, and I love my family, but at the time, they they were kind of like, this is your bed, you know?
Yeah.
This was your
Yeah.
choice. Good luck.
Good luck with that. Yeah,
And
exactly.
I actually never talk about this. Um, but like finding that, cultivating that courage, because
Yeah.
it is about more than you.
Yeah.
And you know, as much as I talk about not liking the indoctrination, I do have a faith, and I look back and I am just so grateful
Yeah.
to God, um, for getting me through that,
Yep.
for giving me that little bit of courage,
Yeah.
that little
Yeah.
bit that was enough to step out. And I think about, life now. I'm 7 years old. People will say, like, oh, you have so much joy for life. I'm like, yeah, I'm a 7-year old. Because
Yeah.
I'm 7 years into this chapter, this part of my life, this book.
Yes. Yeah, that's interesting. Oh, I guess we're gonna be 7-year-olds together. 2014 was a big year for me as well,
Yeah.
and, a year that I finally allowed myself to see the door and step through it, and it is, it is challenging to talk about these things, and as you said, you know, there's still not a lot of understanding as to, why are we showing up? Why are we showing up authentically? Why, yeah, and what is that fine line where we're not vomiting out our personal dramas
Yes.
but that we are, in fact, sharing the elements of our stories. And that fine line, as you and I think, have both agreed
Mhm.
previously, is that for others to hear that there is, there's beginning, middle, and an end, right?
Yeah.
This is what it looked like before. Can you relate to that?
Right.
This is what the
The mess in the middle looks
cataclysmic,
like.
right? The starburst, like
Yeah.
that's what that, a cataclysmic event, looks like. And then here's this pathway with these very specific elements that we
Right.
utilized in order to be 7 and not 0,
Right.
and not negative 0, not less than 0, right?
Yeah.
And being on that journey forward. And I think the other key is it's not just about normalization. It's teachable,
Right.
right? It's not just that we liberate people by sharing our story. It's saying, on the way to becoming myself, I found out a couple of things. They might
Yeah.
be helpful.
Right.
I look back at what I've been through in my own personal life, not just since 2014, but since I was a tiny little girl, and I realized I became a warrior, like bar
Yeah.
none, come hell or high water, bootstrap it, pull yourself together, get it done.
Yeah.
That's who I became by the time I was 4. And I became more and more of that with every trauma. And while there is an amazing gift in the warrior self, you learn to compartmentalize, you learn to disconnect, you learn to dissociate, you learn to numb out. And unfortunately, that makes you incapable of connecting to other people in a meaningful way. You can't have a relationship unless you know how to connect heart to
Yeah.
heart, soul to soul with the other person. And if it's always been dangerous, then God help you. Like, it's not going to happen. And
Yeah.
so what I learned, there used to be, I'm aging myself now, but there were a whole series of Bing Crosby movies, like On the Way To, and one of them was like On the Way to the Forum. And I use it, and it's silly, but it's like, well, on the way to the forum, this is what I learned, on the
Yeah.
way to growing up, on the
Yeah.
way to becoming myself. I realized there were these actual elements that could liberate me from the warrior self to becoming a wise warrior. Because I don't think, like, I look, and I've done lots of past life regression. Like, I
Yeah.
can go all the way back to my 0 hour,
Mhm.
and the warrior is
Yeah.
within me, and it's not something that I want to divest myself of. But never again do I want to be a warrior with a mask and an armor that disconnect me from other humans or other beings. I want to be able to know that I can always tap into and connect with who I am at my core. And I figured out some things that allowed me to come up with those proprietary pillars that I can actually teach other people. I
Mhm.
can lead them through that process
Yeah.
that helped me find myself and be
Right.
myself. And I think that is the difference. You and I were
Mhm.
kind of grappling with, like, how do you
Yeah.
not just vomit out your story?
Right, and
But
it's one of the reasons I don't share a lot of my personal story because I'm all about empowering people to be the best versions of themselves, and so my form of coaching is the past informs
yeah,
the future, but the past, we don't stay there. There
yeah,
are psychologists, right? There are people that do that work. That's not what I do as a coach. I take you here. We'll look at your limiting beliefs. We'll look at your past only as much as they affect where we're going.
mhm,
And so it's interesting when you were talking about being a warrior with armor. I find I still struggle with that.
mhm,
Um, I've positioned my entire life to be, this boundary around me. I'm the coach, right? I can give to you, I can share with you, but you can't give back, right? People ask me, like,
yeah,
why haven't you remarried? Well, armor,
yeah,
right?
sure,
Like, it's a process and I'm still in it.
Yeah.
I'm still in that process, but along the way, you're right. I've learned so much. It was about clarity. It was about courage. It was about that necessity
Mhm.
to live a better life, to create a life for me and my children. And when you have to start over, the question is, what's it really all about? And so to dive into a deeper purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that most of us who have been through traumatic experiences have found that the only way through is actually by finding that purpose and meaning.
Right.
And, in the world of psychology, we look for post-traumatic growth.
Right.
That is when you've come far enough through the traumas that you can then enable others to learn from your process and your
Right.
experience, and that you're no longer sort of bleeding on people, but you're
Yes.
able to actually share things and even share them very
Right.
emotionally,
Yeah.
but that it's no longer for the purpose of the self, right? It's to begin
Right.
to allow the
Yeah.
other to better understand the journey as well. Yeah,
Absolutely.
I've shared about this before, and I no doubt you've seen my new series, my Wisdom Wednesday series on my journey with cancer. And I was having yet another conversation with somebody yesterday who had said, it's the, pardon my German, but the fuck cancer conversation.
Yeah.
And I said, I don't feel that way about my cancer. And I
Yeah.
can tell you exactly why, because this occurred in my life. I've had lots of divine 2x4 therapy.
Mhm.
This occurred in my life for a very specific wake up call. And while I am, I specialize in integrative medicine, I'm a
Yeah.
healer and shaman in my own
Right.
right. So then comes the question, well, why don't you just heal yourself?
Mm.
Okay, well, let me tell you exactly why.
Right.
Because left to my own devices, there is still a part of me that continues to heal and would absolutely go right back into the unhealthy circumstances if there wasn't something stopping me.
Right.
And so I've been actually very, very thankful to this cancer showing up the way it has,
Mhm.
because it's kept me, from doing something that wouldn't have been good for me and wouldn't have been good for my children. And it's allowed me, it's like bought me the stall, right? It's
Mhm.
allowed me the time that I needed to really create the sanctuary to just be myself, every part
Yeah.
of who I am, and to never again desire a relationship in which I'm invisible.
Mhm.
And if that means that I have to go through, the treatment that I have to go through instead of simply healing myself and moving on,
Right.
well, then that's what it costs me. That's what it is. And I even understand why that's a gift in my life. So
Yeah.
that's a hard one to
It
conceptualize,
is.
but
And it's hard. It's definitely, you can do that for yourself, but we can't tell people that when they're
right,
suffering. But I
right.
was talking to a client of mine who is dealing with cancer right now as well, and we were talking actually earlier today, and I was saying to him, in Eastern philosophy, it's dis-ease.
Right.
And anytime there's dis-ease in your life for a long amount of time, it shows up.
Sure.
It shows up in some way, and it often shows up as illness.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
through all of my yoga trainings and all of my studies there, that really resonated with me, because if you think about the times in our life where there is a sickness, there's an illness, there's usually something else going on. It's a
Oh,
deeper issue,
absolutely.
right? And
It
so
is.
it's amazing that we don't talk about that more.
Yeah. Yeah. Very few people know. I'm a counseling psychologist
Yeah.
rather than a clinical psychologist. There are very few of our programs left in the United States,
Mhm.
but most people don't understand actually the difference.
Yeah.
And in counseling psychology, we believe in the illness of fit between person and place.
Mm.
So if a person is in circumstances that don't support their growth or their stability,
Mhm.
they'll become symptomatic. And when we look at, as you said, dis-ease, that's a term we use a
Right.
lot, you know, that's really what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And it can be the development of a physical disease, a mental disease. It doesn't really matter. And for the most part, even with something like schizophrenia, if you take somebody who has schizophrenia
Mhm.
and you place them in a facility that's designed specifically with structure and other people who are going to follow that structure, it's amazing how their symptoms come right down. It doesn't take away the schizophrenia,
Right.
but, which is brain-based, unfortunately,
Yeah.
but it makes them far less symptomatic, just the same way that you move out of a
Mhm.
toxic relationship and
Right.
suddenly a lot of your symptoms get a
Right.
lot
I
better.
I look and feel and show up in an entirely different way, like a different person. My oldest son had severe ADHD, dyslexia. Now his dyslexia is always, but his ADHD. When my former husband moved out, he asked to go off of his medicine. He
Ah.
went off of his medicine. He now is one of the most chill human beings. He's almost lethargic sometimes. I almost want to like poke him and be like, what? What happened to
Yeah.
this wild kid?
Yeah.
ADHD, it was environmental. It
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
anxiety showing up
Sure.
as ADHD.
Yeah. And
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 when the
anxiety,
anxiety
like the
was gone,
propensity for anxiety,
yeah,
it's genetic. So
right.
again, but there are lots of us that, have that stuff below the surface, and that you
Yeah.
put us in the right environment, it's all good. You
Yeah.
put us in the wrong environment, not so good.
And
Yeah.
it just blows my mind because obviously nobody was seeing that,
Mm.
right? You don't see it until it shifts. My peace lily that I'd gotten as a gift when my
Mhm.
grandmother passed away had
Mhm.
never bloomed. And 6 months after my former husband moved out of the house, it bloomed
Oh,
beautifully.
oh,
3
beautiful.
giant blooms, and,
Because you'd found your peace finally.
it's energetic. It's shocking when you can see it that way. Like when you see
Yeah.
a child who needs medication to sit still,
Yeah.
go from this to this.
Yeah.
And when you see a flower that I almost got rid of because I'm like, it's dead. It's not ever going
Yeah.
to bloom. And then suddenly it's becoming glorious.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I feel that way in my own life. It was a journey. It didn't happen overnight, but I feel like 7 years later, as a 7-year-old, I can say, like, I love my life.
Yeah.
I've taken the steps to get clear on
Mm.
what works and what doesn't work. And I've created an environment conducive to my growth. And I've stepped forward courageously because I needed to for my children. And like, it's amazing what's possible.
Yeah. I
Unfortunately, so many people don't wake up to it.
Yes. Well, you're right. I mean, I think that our best clients, especially our best executive clients, where they notice there's an issue, either they had, for me, either lots of personnel issues,
Mhm.
or they have a relationship that somehow isn't going well at home.
Yeah.
And they come in and they may have no idea what's going on below the surface for them. May have no idea they need to do breakthrough work. They just know something's not working, or
Right.
they're doing messaging, their languaging's off, they're not being heard, the
Yeah.
team's not responding to the messages they put out,
Mhm.
and they have no idea why. And
Right.
yet, when we just direct them ever so slightly into what's lurking below the surface, suddenly there's this like, oh my gosh,
Right.
wow, okay, let me
Yes.
deal with that. And then they deal with it and everything changes.
Mhm.
And it's such a gift to be able to work with people who, especially for me, I wanted legacy. I'd reached a point in my life where I wanted one to many. I wanted to work with leaders, and I do work with leaders and entrepreneurs who are touching big teams.
Yeah.
So I love when they're able to come in and make those shifts for themselves. And then suddenly the next thing you know, like their whole team is being affected, their families affected, their communities are affected. And you're like, yes, got it.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. And that resonates with me too on so many levels because the first step is to awaken that. I am almost always hired to help people with their career issues. I need to be more productive. I need to be better at sales. And it almost always ends up in the personal realm. And it's that awakening. Like, you have to wake up. You have to learn what you don't know. There's something missing. Let's discover it. And then once they discover it, once they wake up, it's about developing and cultivating that courage to go through that tunnel, right? Like to go through the work so you can become empowered and you can gain that courage and you can live your best life. And then from there, they inspire others. And it does it's that ripple effect. And it's why I will always, like, I do corporate coaching, but I will always keep that like base of one-on-one, because through one, you can affect so many.
It's all one-on-one. Sometimes your message is delivered to a big group of people, but honestly, you're energetically, you're always going one-to-one. And sometimes you actually get to have a session where you're going one-to-one. But yeah, I mean, we're always going, soul to soul, heart to heart. And I love that about the kind of work that we do. I had a question, and it was buried in the very beginning. You've talked a lot about the circumstances that led to your eventually exiting the toxic relationship, moving on into a space of sanctuary where you could become yourself, where your children could become themselves. You were talking about being at a conference at the back of the beginning. And I was very curious if there was any form of epiphany or breakthrough work that occurred at the conference for you, if there was some sort of, pivot there, a catalyst there. Yeah.
So it's interesting. How I ended up there was that my son, my oldest, being severely ADHD dyslexic, the public school was not helping him. And I was a former educator, so I knew that he needed more help. But the private school that could help him cost a lot of money. And so the discussion with my former husband was, I need to go back to work, hopefully at the school, so we can get a discount for my son to attend. And so I went back to get my master's. And during my master's, the school that I wanted to work at said, we work with the 𝐒𝐤𝐬𝐴N Institute on brain-based gender differences. And it's a training you have to have, basically, to work with us. So I needed to go out to Colorado Springs. It was the first time I'd been away from my children.
Wow.
It was the first time I had been away at all on my own in over a decade. And so the work at the conference wasn't it. It was the experience. But I do remember specifically being at the Garden of the Gods. And it was after a session one day. I went there with an interesting person that I'd met at the seminar, and we were walking through, and these women that I didn't know who they were started calling my name, like, "Hi, Julie." Apparently I'd met them at the conference. I didn't remember, but I had an impact on them. And the man I was walking with at the time looked at me and he said, at the end of this conference, people won't remember the keynote speaker, but they're going to remember you. And it hit me.
You were visible. You were visible.
I was visible. And that statement, and then of course I'm in the Garden of the Gods, right? Like, I'm in this amazing place. That statement was like, boom.
Yeah.
And it was this big, like, wool off my eyes, getting hit with an asteroid, like, hello, they know your name. Everybody here knows your name. You exist.
Yes.
And it was that validation that I hadn't had for so many years, that just the recognition that I had something to offer the world because I didn't see it. And yes, being a parent is an amazing job, right? But it's often you're invisible doing it. And for me to recognize that I was not put on this earth to hide my light, but I was created to have an impact on other people's lives. And just by showing up there, not even intentionally, I was having an impact on people's lives. What's possible if I become more purposeful, if I direct my energy toward a cause. And at the time, I didn't know. I was going to become a coach. I just knew that I was created for a bigger purpose, and it was up to me to gain the clarity around it and to have the courage to seek it, create it, and become it.
Well, I love that. There's a phrase that I use often with my clients, and and it doesn't matter what religion anybody is, but I say, and then God walked into the room.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, as you were there, your angels were just sort of, sprinkling themselves around you, and God walked into the room and said, "Guess what? I can see you.
Yeah.
And if you are willing to step through that door, life awaits you."
Yeah.
And the world awaits you. And now here you are
Yeah.
having such an amazing impact on so many other people's lives that you're able to, do this work to help people move through
Right.
their own doors.
Yeah.
So it's extraordinary to have spent time listening to how you reached this place. And I'm so grateful again for your vulnerability and your willingness to share.
Thank you. It was something I had a little trepidation. I'm not going to lie. I had a little bit of trepidation coming today and being here because I thought, okay, again, how does this serve other people? That's always on the forefront of my mind. And what I stepped through, again, courageously, it's always about stepping through with courage, was I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how my story will impact people.
Yeah.
But I know it can.
It's
And I
already
know,
impacted me, so there you go.
if
One.
I don't share it, people don't have the chance.
Yeah,
And someone
exactly.
once told me that when you don't share, it's selfish
Yes.
because you're holding it in and you
Yes.
don't know the impact you can have on people until you share.
Well,
So give yourself permission to open up.
yeah.
Give yourself permission to be real and vulnerable with people. And it's interesting in my line of work, I'm kind of known as a hard ass. You used a German word before, so I'll use this one, right? Like high performance is all about becoming your best self. And sometimes I have to light people up and sometimes I have to slice and dice, but it's always heart-centered, right? It's always with
in the service
helping
of.
them break through.
Mhm.
And sometimes you can water a flower and allow it to bloom on its own. And sometimes you have to get in there and it's like, hey,
You know what? Right. Think about
it's go
gardening.
time.
If a plant is besieged by its dead leaves and its dead branches, if you don't remove them, it's got no shot. If you
Right.
remove them, then all of a sudden, all of that, earth and water and sun, they're all going to the things that can grow and evolve.
Yeah.
And that is a part of our job, is to cut the chaff and
Right.
allow our attention and their attention and energy to be going towards growth and evolution.
Yeah.
So I love that.
And I think
Absolutely.
it's so important for our clients too to see that we didn't just read a book and show up.
Right.
We've been through it. So when we speak about, hey, you need to show up here, you need to be courageous, you need to step forward and make these things happen, you have to take action. Like, no excuses. I did it.
Yes.
You've done it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it's a different energy because we don't take it lightly.
Yeah. There's nothing hypocritical about what we're
Yeah.
saying or teaching,
Right.
And so we've been there and we
Yeah.
have made those movements and we've had that courage and we can help others cultivate that as well.
Right. And that integrity to me is so important because,
Definitely.
there's a lot to be said about the warrior spirit and the person that struggled to overcome and
Yeah.
then inspires and encourages you to do the same.
Absolutely. Well, how can people reach you if they are interested in working with you, chatting with you? How can they reach you?
I do a lot on LinkedIn. It's Julie Hruska, Hruska. I also started my own company, Powerful Leaders. So it's powerfulleaders.com. And
Wow.
if someone's interested in working with me, there's a start today button and there's an application because a lot of people think they're ready or just want to work with me, which is very humbling and beautiful. But like I said earlier, they have to be at a certain place. There's a difference. You know, what you do with psychology, that's not what I do. And some people need a psychologist, some people need a coach. And the awareness comes through that application. So, you know, if someone's very serious about working with me, I invite them to fill out the application, and then I'll reach out and we'll see what they need, because that's part of integrity for me too. I won't take on a client that I don't believe I can help.
Yeah.
It's important to say, you know what, you're an amazing person. I wish you well. You need a psychologist. Or you're an amazing person. I wish you well. You need a business development coach.
Right.
So not everybody is right for high performance coaching. And I invite people to check me out, check out my information on LinkedIn. I post content that if you're paying attention, you can actually transform your life just from my free content. So it's
Wonderful.
awesome. And thank you again for this opportunity. It's been, wow, really powerful, Sage.
Oh,
So
so
thank you.
glad. I'm so glad. Thank you for being with us today. And it's every single time it's eye-opening and transformative just to be here, and to get to know just this breakthrough process for each person. So thank you once again, Julie Hruska.